When German generals watched Tatton's tank circle their Panzers. The next 48 hours, Part 1. The Impossible Turn. December 1944. The Ardennes forest is a graveyard of ice and fire. The German army has just launched their final desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Nearly 300,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 Panzers have smashed through the thin American lines. In the center of this chaos, the town of Bastogne is surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division is trapped, running out of ammo, food, and hope. The German generals, looking at their maps and heated bunkers, are smiling. They see the American First Army shattered. They see the path to Antwerp open. And they see General George S. Patton's Third Army far to the south, over 100 miles away, bogged down in the mud of the Saar region. To the German High Command, Patton is out of the game. They calculate it will take him at least 2 weeks to move his tanks through the snow and ice to reach the battle. They were wrong. They forgot one thing. George S. Patton didn't believe in the laws of logistics. He believed in speed, aggression, and the sheer will of the American soldier. The meeting at Verdun on December 19, 1944, the top Allied commanders gathered in a cold barracks in Verdun. General Dwight D. Eisenhower looked at the room and asked a desperate question. Is there anyone who can start a counterattack? The room was silent. Most generals said they needed days, even weeks to reorganize. Then, Patton stood up. He lit a cigar and said calmly, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours." The room erupted in laughter and disbelief. It was impossible. He had to move 250,000 men, 30,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of supplies across 100 miles of frozen, narrow roads in the middle of a blizzard. It was a tactical nightmare that would take a month in peacetime. But Patton wasn't joking. He had already started moving. The logistics miracle. Before the meeting even ended, Patton's staff was already on the phones. They used a code word, lucky. In the next 48 hours, the world witnessed the greatest military movement in history. Patton's Third Army performed a 90-degree turn in the middle of a battle. Imagine 30,000 vehicles, bumper to bumper, driving through the pitch-black night with their lights off to avoid German bombers. The mechanics were fixing engines on the move. The tank crews were eating cold rations while driving. They didn't sleep. They didn't stop. Patton was everywhere. He stood at the crossroads in the freezing wind, personally directing traffic, screaming at drivers to keep moving. He told them, "We are going to save those brave bastards in Bastogne, and we are going to do it now." The German shock. 48 hours later, German General Hasso von Manteuffel was looking through his binoculars at the southern flank of the Bulge. He expected to see empty roads. Instead, he saw the impossible. The horizon was filled with the low, olive-drab silhouettes of American Sherman tanks. They weren't just arriving. They were attacking. The German generals couldn't believe their eyes. According to every military textbook in the world, Patton should still have been 100 miles away. They called it the Ghost Army. Patton's tanks didn't stop to form lines. They drove straight into the German flank, their treads throwing up frozen dirt and blood. The Panzers, which were designed for long-range duels, suddenly found themselves being circled by fast, aggressive Shermans that were attacking from the side and the rear. The clock is ticking. The next 48 hours would decide the fate of the Western Front. Patton had arrived, but Bastogne was still dying. The Germans were throwing everything they had at the town before the Third Army could break through. Patton looked at his watch. He had promised Eisenhower 48 hours. He had made the turn. He had made the move. But now, he had to break the steel ring of the German Panzers. The storm was getting worse. The planes were grounded. It was just Patton, his tanks, and a ticking clock. The most legendary race in military history had begun. Part 2. The Steel Hurricane. The morning of December 22nd, 1944, dawned with a sky the color of a bruised lung. The blizzard was so thick that a man couldn't see his own hand 3 feet in front of his face. But through the whiteout, the German defenders on the southern flank of the Bulge heard a sound that chilled them more than the wind. It was the high-pitched metallic scream of hundreds of American Sherman tanks. General Patton's Third Army had done the impossible. They had completed their 90-degree turn and were now slamming into the German line like a 7,000-ton sledgehammer. Leading the charge was the 4th Armored Division, the tip of Patton's spear. The duel, speed versus armor. The German generals, including the legendary Hasso von Manteuffel, were quickly losing their confidence. They had the superior tanks, the Panthers and the Tigers. A German Panther tank had thicker armor and a 75mm gun that could cut through a Sherman at over a mile away. But Patton knew the weakness of the German monsters. The Panther was heavy, slow to turn, and its turret moved with the speed of a dying snail. Patton's order to his tank commanders was simple. Don't fight them head-on. Circle them. Outrun them. Get behind them and shove a shell into their thin rear armor. This was the Steel Hurricane. American tank crews used their superior speed to perform a deadly dance. While the German commanders struggled to crank their heavy turrets to find a target, the Shermans were already on their flanks. It was a chaotic, close-quarters brawl in the frozen forests. Tank commanders stood half-exposed in their hatches, screaming orders over the roar of the engines. When a Sherman's shell hit the side of a German Panzer, the sound was like a giant bell ringing in hell. The Patton prayer, while his tanks were fighting, Patton was fighting a different kind of war. He was fighting the weather. The heavy clouds prevented the Allied Air Force from flying. Without air support, his tanks were vulnerable to German anti-tank traps. Patton, a man known for his foul mouth and his ivory-handled revolvers, did something that surprised everyone. He called for a chaplain and ordered him to write a prayer. He wanted a prayer for good weather, not for peace, but for the chance to kill the enemy. The prayer was printed on 250,000 small cards and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. It read, "Sir, I am tired of the snow. Give us 24 hours of clear skies so we can kill the Germans who are killing our boys." The soldiers looked at the cards, then at the sky, and then back at their general. They realized that Patton wasn't just leading an army, he was leading a crusade. The road to Chaumont, the fighting reached a fever pitch at a small village called Chaumont. The German 6th Panzer Army had dug in with elite paratroopers and heavy tanks. They knew that if they could stop Patton here, the boys in Bastogne would starve or surrender. The battle for Chaumont was a nightmare of fire and ice. Sherman tanks were sliding on the frozen roads, firing their machine guns at anything that moved. The Germans fought for every house, every barn, and every cellar. Inside the town, the air was thick with the smell of burning diesel and cordite. American infantry, the doughboys, moved through the snow behind the tanks, using the massive steel hulls for cover. By the end of the day, the Americans had taken the village, but the cost was high. The roads were littered with the blackened husks of burned-out tanks. Yet, Patton didn't allow his men to stop for a single hour. He knew that every minute he spent resting was a minute closer to the fall of Bastogne. The circle closes back in the German bunkers. The mood had turned to panic. The German generals watched their maps in disbelief as the blue lines of Patton's army continued to circle and bypass their strongpoints. They had expected a slow, methodical American advance. Instead, they were facing a lightning war, a blitzkrieg, fought in American English. The Third Army was now only 7 miles from Bastogne. They could hear the artillery of the 101st Airborne in the distance. The German ring around the town was being squeezed from both sides. Patton checked his ivory-handled revolvers and looked at his watch. The 48 hours were almost up. He had made the move. He had survived the first clash of steel. Now he had to break the final German line and reach the men who were holding the line. The sky began to crack. The wind began to shift. The next 24 hours would determine if Patton's prayer would be answered, or if the Steel Hurricane would finally run out of fuel. Part 3, The Miracle of the Skies, December 23, 1944. For nearly a week, A thick, suffocating blanket of fog and snow had crippled the Allied war machine. The greatest air force in history was grounded, while the boys of the 101st Airborne in Bastogne were being pounded into the frozen mud by German artillery. General Patton's tanks were 7 miles away, fighting through a wall of German steel, but they were slowing down. The German Panzers were hidden in the tree lines, waiting to ambush any American Sherman that moved on the icy roads. Patton needed a miracle. He needed the sun. Then it happened. As if the hand of God had reached down and swept the sky clean, the Patton weather arrived. The fog vanished in minutes. The sun hit the snow with a blinding glare. For the German generals in their bunkers, the sight of that blue sky was more terrifying than 1,000 cannons. They knew exactly what was coming. The roar of the thunderbolts back at the airfields in France and England. The engines of thousands of planes roared to life at once. The silence of the winter was shattered by the scream of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. This was the hammer hitting the anvil. While Patton's tanks pushed from the south, the Allied Air Force turned the Ardennes forest into a corridor of fire. From the cockpit, the pilots could see the German supply lines stretched out like sitting ducks on the white snow. The German Panzers, which had been circling Bastogne, were now the ones being circled from above. American pilots dropped thousands of tons of explosives and napalm. They shredded the Tiger tanks and destroyed the fuel trucks that the Germans desperately needed. The German generals watched their master plan evaporate in the heat of 1,000 explosions. They had gambled on the weather staying bad. They lost. Cobra King in the final sprint on the ground. Patton didn't waste a single second of the sunlight. He grabbed his radio and gave the order that would go down in history. Full speed ahead. Don't worry about your flanks. Don't worry about the fuel. Just get to Bastogne. Leading the charge was a single battle-scarred Sherman jumbo tank nicknamed Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess. Cobra King was at the head of the 4th Armored Division. They weren't just driving. They were charging. They bypassed German strongpoints, ignored sniper fire, and smashed through barricades made of frozen trees. Behind them, the road was a graveyard of German anti-tank guns. Patton's Steel Hurricane had become a tidal wave. The German paratroopers, who had been told the Americans were defeated, looked in horror as a wall of American steel emerged from the woods, moving faster than any tank should move in the snow. The handshake at the perimeter at 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26th. The crew of Cobra King saw something through their periscopes that made them cheer. They saw the skeletal remains of the trees around the village of Assenois. And beyond that, they saw the foxholes of the 101st Airborne. The paratroopers didn't believe it at first. They thought it was another German trick. But then they saw the white star on the side of the tank. They saw the dirty, grinning face of an American tanker leaning out of the hatch. Lieutenant Boggess jumped down from his tank and walked up to a weary paratrooper. No words were needed. It was a handshake that signaled the end of the German dream. Patton had promised 48 hours to start the move. He had delivered a miracle in less than a week. The ring was broken. Bastogne was free. The German retreat, in the German high command, the mood was one of pure, dark realization. They had watched Patton's tanks circle their Panzers, and then they had watched the sky rain fire. Their great gamble had failed. The German generals began to issue the orders they dreaded most: withdrawal. They had tried to break the American spirit, but they had only succeeded in awakening a giant that was now standing on their doorstep. Patton wasn't satisfied with just reaching Bastogne. He wanted to chase the Germans all the way to Berlin. He stood on a hill overlooking the battlefield, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the winter sun, and looked east. The Battle of the Bulge was not over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. George S. Patton had turned the tide of history with nothing but iron, cussing, and a prayer that actually worked. Part 4. The Shadow of the Third Army. The breakthrough at Bastogne was not the end of the war, but for the German High Command, it was the moment the music stopped. As the first American supply trucks rolled into the liberated town, carrying blood plasma and ammunition. A different kind of payload was being delivered to Berlin, the realization of total defeat. In the underground bunkers of the Reich, the German generals were performing a post-mortem on their failed gamble. They had expected to trap the Americans in a web of ice and fire. Instead, they found themselves being hunted by a man who moved faster than their maps could be updated. The Butcher's Bill. German General Hasso von Manteuffel would later write that the speed of Patton's arrival was the most brilliant maneuver of the entire war. But in the final days of 1944, there was no time for compliments. The German army had lost nearly 100,000 men and over 800 tanks in the Ardennes. But the greatest loss was the one that couldn't be measured in numbers: the loss of the initiative. Hitler had spent his last reserves of fuel and elite troops on this great gamble. He had hoped to shatter the Allied coalition. Instead, he had only succeeded in proving that General Patton could move an entire army across a frozen continent faster than most people could move a single suitcase. The German generals now looked at Patton not just as an enemy, but as a force of nature. They began to refer to him as the American Rommel, but with 10 times the industrial power and zero regard for the rules of exhaustion. The no-rest doctrine. While the rest of the Allied command wanted to pause and reorganize after Bastogne, Patton refused. He knew that the only way to keep a wounded enemy down was to keep hitting them. He didn't give his tank crews 24 hours to sleep. He didn't give his mechanics a day off to fix the engines. He stood on the muddy roads and screamed, "The Germans are on the run. If we stop to catch our breath, they'll stop to dig in. Keep moving." The Third Army became a relentless machine of pursuit. They crossed the Rhine River in March of 1945, an act that Patton performed with his typical flair for the dramatic. He didn't just cross the bridge. He famously stopped in the middle of it to perform a gesture of pure defiance into the water below, signaling his total contempt for the borders of the Reich. The psychological shadow. By the time the Third Army was racing toward the heart of Germany, Patton's reputation was doing half the fighting for him. German units were surrendering by the thousands, not because they were out of ammo, but because they heard Patton's tanks were coming. The fear of being circled, of the Patton turn, had become a psychological plague among the German infantry. The German generals realized that Patton had changed the nature of war. He had turned logistics into a weapon. He had shown that a nation's industrial might, its trucks, its fuel, its spare parts, could be used as aggressively as a bayonet. Patton was now covering 40, 50, sometimes 60 miles a day. He was moving so fast that his own supply lines were screaming for him to slow down. He told them, "I'll find my own fuel. The Germans have plenty of it, and they won't be needing it where they're going." The legacy of the 48 hours, as we look back at the winter of 1944, the impossible turn remains the gold standard for military leadership. It was a moment when one man's will overrode the cold calculus of the impossible. Patton didn't just save Bastogne. He saved the momentum of the Western world. He proved that in the face of a crisis, speed is the ultimate form of courage. When Patton passed away shortly after the war, even his former enemies paid him the highest respect. They understood that they hadn't just been defeated by a better tank or a bigger bomb. They had been defeated by a philosophy of action, a philosophy that said, "Lead me, follow me, or get out of my way." The engines of the Third Army have long been silent. The snow has melted from the Ardennes. But the lesson of those 48 hours still echoes in every military academy and every boardroom in the world. If you want to change the course of history, you don't wait for the weather to clear. You turn the army, you snap the wire, and you drive through the storm. General George S. Patton and his Ghost Army showed us that the only true limit to what an army or a person can achieve is the limit of their own imagination and their own daring. The race is over. The victory is won. And the legend of the Steel Hurricane lives on. Part 5. The Engine of Victory. History remembers the generals. It remembers the ivory-handled revolvers of George Patton and the defiant nuts of the paratroopers in Bastogne. But there is another story, written in grease, sweat, and diesel fuel, that is often left in the mud of the Ardennes. To move 250,000 men and 30,000 vehicles 90 degrees in 48 hours wasn't just a miracle of leadership. It was the greatest logistical hot rod move in the history of mankind. Behind every Sherman tank that slammed into the German flank, there were 10 men who hadn't slept in 3 days, fighting a war against gravity, friction, and the freezing point of oil. The architects of the impossible, while Patton was at the front, his G4, the logistics officers, were performing a feat that would make a modern shipping company look like amateurs. They had to reroute over 60,000 tons of supplies in the middle of a blizzard. They didn't have computers. They didn't have GPS. They had paper maps, stubby pencils, and a fleet of radio operators who were screaming until their voices gave out. They had to create a one-way highway system through the narrow, winding roads of France and Belgium. They called it the Red Ball Express spirit. Thousands of trucks, driven mostly by African American soldiers who were the backbone of the Army's mobility, pushed their vehicles far beyond their breaking points. They drove through the night without headlights, using only cat-eye slits to see the road. They navigated through minefields and around blown-out bridges. If a truck broke down, they didn't wait for a tow. They pushed it into the ditch and kept the column moving. Patton's rule was absolute. Nothing stops the flow. The mechanics of the cold in the winter of 1944. The cold was a more dangerous enemy than the German 88mm gun. At 20 degrees below zero, the oil in the Sherman tanks turned into the consistency of molasses. Steel became brittle and would snap like glass. The mechanics of the Third Army developed battlefield hacks that would later become legendary. They built giant bonfires under the tank hulls just to thaw out the engines so they could start. They mixed gasoline with heavy grease to keep the treads moving. They worked in the open air, their skin freezing to the metal of their wrenches. They performed engine swaps in the middle of snow-covered fields, often under sniper fire. They were the men who ensured that when Patton stepped on the gas, the engine actually roared. The Patton Doctrine of Logistics. Patton was the first general to realize that in modern war, the truck was just as important as the tank. He famously said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." He authorized his supply officers to liberate fuel from any source they could find. They raided Allied depots, they captured German fuel dumps, and they even siphoned gas from broken-down civilian cars. This relentless focus on forward supply is what allowed the Third Army to maintain its speed. While the Germans were still using horses to pull much of their artillery, the Americans were a fully mechanized tsunami. This technological and logistical gap was the real reason the German Panzers were circled. You can't fight a ghost that has an infinite supply of fuel. The modern shadow. As the sun set on the ruins of the Third Reich, the world realized that war had changed forever. The 48-hour turn became the blueprint for every modern rapid deployment force. When you see a modern army move across a desert or a continent in a matter of days, you are seeing the ghost of Patton's Third Army. You are seeing the legacy of the truck drivers, the mechanics, and the radio operators who proved that speed is a product of preparation and grit. The Sherman tanks are now monuments in town squares. The trucks have rusted away. But the lesson remains. An army is only as fast as the men who fix the wheels. The generals got the medals. The tanks got the glory. But the war was won by the men who kept the engines running when the world was freezing over. The final salute to the grease monkeys. So we take a moment to look past the stars on the shoulders and the ivory on the revolvers. We look at the stained coveralls and the frostbitten fingers. They were the silent partners in the steel hurricane. They were the reason the impossible became a reality. Without them, Patton would have just been a man with a map. With them, he was the master of time and space on the battlefield. The engines are quiet now. The roads are clear. But if you listen closely to the wind in the Ardennes, you can still hear the phantom rumble of 30,000 vehicles, turning 90 degrees into history. Part 6. The soldier's verdict. History often boils a man down to a single image. For George S. Patton, it's the high-polished helmet, the ivory-handled revolvers, and the legendary foul mouth. But when the dust finally settled on the frozen roads of Bastogne, and the Third Army stood at the gates of Germany, the world had to look past the theater and see the truth. The impossible turn, that 90-degree pivot in the middle of a blizzard, wasn't just a trick of logistics. It was the ultimate expression of a man who understood the most precious resource in war: time. To the German generals who watched his tanks circle their Panzers, Patton was a ghost. To the Allied High Command, he was a headache. But to the men in the foxholes, he was the only reason they were still breathing. The man behind the mask, Patton, was a paradox. He was a wealthy aristocrat who could swear like a sailor. He was a man who believed in reincarnation, but studied modern technology with a religious fervor. During those 48 hours of the Ardennes move, Patton didn't just sit in a heated command post. He was a frontline general. He was seen standing at icy intersections, personally directing traffic. He would stop individual tanks to talk to the drivers, checking if they had warm socks and enough grease for their guns. He understood that an army doesn't move on orders alone. It moves on the belief that the man at the top knows what the hell he's doing. By showing up in the cold, by sharing the mud with his soldiers, Patton turned 250,000 men into a single unstoppable extension of his own will. The German fear after the war. Captured German officers were interrogated about who they feared most. They didn't name Eisenhower, the diplomat. They didn't name Montgomery, the methodical planner. They named Patton. The German military culture was built on Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. They were the masters of speed. But in Patton, they met an American who beat them at their own game. They couldn't understand how an American army, which they considered soft and industrial, could move with such predatory speed. One German general remarked that fighting Patton was like fighting a forest fire. Every time you thought you had it contained, it had already moved 5 miles behind you. The ghost in the Pentagon. The legacy of Patton's move toward Bastogne changed the United States military forever. Before 1944, the American Army was seen as a massive, slow-moving hammer. After Patton, it became a lightning-fast rapier. The concept of rapid deployment, the ability to move a massive force across a continent in hours, not weeks, is the direct result of the lessons learned in that Ardennes blizzard. Every modern armored division, every rapid response unit, and every logistical commander in the 21st century is a student of the Patton turn. They learned that speed is armor and that momentum is the best defense. The final sunset. George Patton did not die on the battlefield. He died in a car accident shortly after the war ended, a quiet end for a man who lived for the roar of the cannon. But his real end came when he was buried in the American cemetery in Luxembourg, right in the heart of the land he had liberated. In a final act of humility, he was buried not in a grand monument, but under a simple white cross, exactly like the thousands of soldiers who had followed him into the snow. He chose to stay with his men. The ivory-handled revolvers are in a museum now. The Sherman tanks are relics. But the spirit of the Third Army, the spirit that says, "Find a way or make one," is still alive. Whenever a leader faces a crisis and chooses speed over hesitation, whenever a mechanic stays up all night to keep a machine running, and whenever an army does what the manuals say is impossible, George Patton is there. He was the steel hurricane. He was the soldier's general. And in those 48 hours, when the world was freezing over, he was the fire that brought the light back to Bastogne.